We have not ever reckoned with what actually happened on this land to make us who we are today. So we look at days like January 6th. We look at voter suppression and voter subversion that's happening. Jesus says, I am the truth. To crush the truth is to crush Jesus. To embrace the truth is to embrace Jesus. 70% of Americans claim Christian faith, and yet we're fine not knowing the truth. And there's no way for us to become a different society, to do differently, without knowing how we broke the world, without knowing how these hierarchies of human belonging that we established through law from 1619 forward, from Fortune's days to right now. We can't stop the patterns if we don't reckon with them.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. We talk to guests who do all sorts of interesting things and a number of authors over the weeks and months. Today, we have someone who I know and who is a leader in her field, and that is Lisa Sharon Harper. She's author of a new book called Fortune. This is what it looks like. I'm going to read the subtitle in a second, but I want to show you that I've got the actual book here. And the subtitle is How Race Broke My Family and the World and How to Restore It, Repair It All. I should have put my reading glasses on. That's pathetic, isn't it? I mean, if I can't, that's big copy down there and I'm squinting at it. So, you know, it's a sad statement. But anyway, welcome, Lisa. Before we get into the book, let's just locate you. I know that probably when I first met you somewhere, I forget where, maybe the Wild Goose Festival or Red Letter Christians or something, you were doing things with Sojourner magazine, and I know you've written for them. Let's just talk a little bit about, not this book at first, but your path as a writer and commentator. You do a lot of things. Let's just do the writer-commentator part. You've got some other books, you've written a lot of articles. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, my very first book was written in New York City before I joined Sojourners, called Evangelical Does Not Equal Republican or Democrat. I think you would appreciate that. And it was 2008, running up to the 2008 election is when it came out. And the next one, I mean, there's just been several books. And then I joined the Sojourners team in 2011 as their director of mobilizing, and eventually became their Chief Church Engagement Officer. So the person out there in the world trying to connect Sojourners with the rest of the church. And in that time, I loved my time there because it really placed me in the center of a lot of the places where this question of race is clashing in the world. I flew to Ferguson and was responsible for helping to organize the multi-ethnic church to engage in the Hands Up, Don't Shoot movement. And then Baltimore, helping churches, again, multi-ethnic and white churches, to engage in that movement there. And then finally, after leaving Sojourners, after 6 really awesome years, powerful years, marched in Charlottesville in witness of another way of being together in the world, and stood literally face to face with a militiaman, singing This Little Light of Mine for hours before all the mayhem broke out. And so my path has been one of placing my body as a living witness of another way of being in the world. And over the last 30 years, I've been doing all this family research, and also, of course, research just as a journalist and as a commentator, rather. I started realizing my family history is really intersecting with a lot of the moments where America is making its decisions about how we will live together according to racial hierarchy. So I realized my family story is more than my family story. It's all of our story. So that's why I needed to write it down.
You know, there's a lot of this in the book, but I want to dig into it just in an interview format first, and then you can mention what's in the book and what's not. But tell me a little bit about your family. You know, a lot of my writing is semi-biographical. I've written memoirs and novels based on my growing up in the evangelical community, and I tend to write both fiction and nonfiction like I hope most writers do based on what you know something about. Talk to me about your mom, your dad, your family, who your parents were, what sort of people they were, what did they do? Don't, you know, no one's read the book yet. It's coming out in a couple of days. I won't, mention a day because sometimes our podcast is a little later, but we're recording this just before it comes out. I got an advance copy. Thank you very much. But tell me about your family. You know, my thumbnail would be my dad was an evangelical minister. He became very famous in the evangelical community. My own journey has taken me away from that community. You know, first question, are you still sort of the person you were raised to be? Would you recognize yourself, your 12-year-old self, your 15-year-old self, or are you a very different kind of person now? Not age-wise, but just where do you come from? Who are you?
I hear you. I think my mom was a member of SNCC here in Philadelphia. She joined SNCC, I think, at 17, 18 years old, right after graduating from high school. My dad had investigated CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, in New York City, literally visited meetings and attended meetings the same summer of the Freedom Summer where Mickey Schwerner and Michael Goodwin went down to Mississippi and were assassinated along with James Chaney. It was a time that was America was in upheaval, much like it is today. And my parents chose to be a part of the push. And after that, my mom became a judge of elections here in Philadelphia, up in the West Oak Lane area, and took me around with her. Literally, like we went knocking door to door to make sure that our neighbors were signed up to vote. So she's very, very civically minded and engaged. And we watched Roots about a billion times. You know, it came out when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And I literally was sat down in front of the TV to watch it every single time it came out for about a decade after that. So I think I saw Roots about maybe 20 times. And Aunt Kizzy became my Aunt Kizzy, right? But I couldn't go back any further than like my grandmother for many years. And then finally started to do the research. And I have to say that I am more than my mom and my dad. I am my great-grandmother, Lizzie, who left South Carolina when the post-Reconstruction laws levied a boom on the Black community, saying that they could not work in any industries other than the fields or the houses, which is very much like they were trying to recreate slaveocracy. And she said, "I'm out." But she only took her lightest skinned daughter, and the other darker skinned children, my grandmother among them, they were left behind to so that she could establish herself by passing in Philadelphia. She was eventually found out, did send for her darker children. And my grandmother, she would not speak of her years in South Carolina because they were so horrible. And we were impacted by that. She was depressed for much of her life because of her experience in Jim Crow South. I am my third time great grandmother, Leah, who was born in 1836 or 35. I think it's 1836. She lived through slavery. She was enslaved. She lost, we believe, about 5 children that are just completely lost to oblivion. And that was like that morning, that familiarity with loss was passed down in my family and impacted further generations. But there was also an amazing resilience that was passed down. Fortune herself, Fortune, who the book is named after, was born in 1687, and her body and soul and mind absorbed the wrath of the very first race laws. And those race laws were crafted in order to deal with the perceived problem on the ground of mixed race children, and of which she was one. So she was indentured until 31 because her mother was white, and not enslaved because her mother was white, because that's how the laws had morphed by that time. And her sister, her daughter, Betty, she owned land. She was free and owned land in Maryland by 1756. And it's recorded that she never paid the extra tax that was levied on free Black women. There was an actual Black tax on free Black women. And she came out to the tax collector and said, "I'm not paying." And they actually recorded it in their journal. And you can find that recording now. So I think that there's there are strategies of resilience and rebellion that I have also garnered from my family that I'm very proud of. The fact that my mother was a part of SNCC, the fact that Lizzie came north and left everything behind because she knew that she was worth more than working in the fields or in some white man's house.
To give people a little bit of the flavor of the book before I get into the table of contents and start asking you things.
Sure.
Do you have a copy handy?
I do.
Okay, take a look at it a second, because I want you to do something, and I didn't prepare you for this. It's not difficult, by the way. It's a nice thing. This is not a trick.
Okay, no
I'm going to put my glasses on, and I want you to open your book to the photograph signature in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
And the first one is Lee Ballard.
Yeah, Leah Ballard.
Leah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can assume I'm going to mispronounce 10, 20, okay. 30, 40% of the names here. Ernie, my producer, is laughing. He helps me do this, right? I've had him phonetically spell out the guest's name. 10 minutes into the interview, I'm still screwing it up. But I actually am a dyslexic, so you know what I'm saying here. I think a good way to get a handle on your book, yes, you're holding it up, and it is, here's mine. There we are, mirror image. Let's go through these pictures in the middle. I like photo signatures. Let's talk about each of these people as you turn the page. Talk me through this, and I will hold it up as you do, because I think a good way to get into this book is through these pictures. For someone just thinking, if you're in a bookstore, I'm thumbing through it. Let's thumb through the book together.
Yeah,
tell me about these guys.
All right. So Leah was the last enslaved woman in our family. She likely had 17 children, but only 12 are listed on any census. And when I did the research, I found that 1 in 3 children in the Low Country of South Carolina, enslaved children, did not survive past their first birthday.
Yeah.
That blew my mind.
Yeah.
That just gives you such a picture of the degradation that they experienced. Now, she was in the High Country. There, 1 in 3 children didn't make it past their 16th birthday.
Yeah.
Okay. So it is very possible that, and also many of the children, especially around the time when she was in her prime birthing years, just before the Civil War, many of the children were being sold into the deeper South, into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, the rest. And so we don't know, but we do know that there's DNA traces that go into Georgia. So that's very likely that they were. So 5 of her children were lost. Her other child, Martha, she gave birth to Martha on the as the Civil War was coming to a close, and Martha ended up dying in childbirth because there were no hospitals that would take Black people in South Carolina. So it was just her and the midwife, and that had been the case really since we were ever here. Never hospitals for us. So we lost many women actually in our family to medical racism.
Yeah, let's talk about this person then here.
Yeah, so this is my great-great-grandfather, Philip Fortune. So Philip Fortune was my first clue that something's up in our family, because Philip, we found his name on the census before the Civil War. And that's really, really, really rare in Black families, because it means that your ancestor was free before the Civil War. And I was like, so how is Philip Fortune free? I mean, why are we seeing him on the census? And it turned out that DNA clusters show us, and also written genealogies of Fortune Game McGee that I talked about a little bit ago, they show us that we are connected to that family. And ultimately it goes back to Fortune Game McGee. And so I need to talk about Fortune to talk about Philip. Philip eventually moved to New York City from Virginia. He was in Virginia, but he moved to New York City. And he actually settled and lived in Brooklyn. And it turned out to be just blocks away from where my sister lives right now. And she had no idea, but they lived in the same area of Brooklyn. But so Philip is a direct descendant from Fortune Game McGee. And Fortune was born in 1687, only 23 years after the very first race laws were passed in the colony of Maryland. And Fortune was the product of an illegitimate, as they would call it, marriage, not marriage, union between Maudlin McGee and Ulster Scott. and Sambo game. Sambo was his actual Senegalese name, and it meant second son. When I first heard that his name was Sambo, I was ashamed. I was like,
Yeah,
oh, no,
I understand.
really? Are you saying he was the original Sambo? Like,
Yeah.
what? No, oh no. But actually, and that's actually what I found in my research, is that there were many, many, many Sambos.
Yeah, it was a common name.
Very common. It just literally meant second son. And so that's why people of European descent, after the fall of Reconstruction, they then took that name Sambo and made it mean something.
Yeah.
Through propaganda that was very twisted and
Yeah.
denigrating. But the original name was actually one of honor. So Sambo and Maudlin got together, they had an affair, and they had Fortune. And Fortune stood before a court in 1705. And that court then judged her to be worthy of being indentured until she was 31. Now get this. She had children in the midst of her indenture to Mary Day. Mary Day was a noble class woman who was granted basically all of Southern Maryland by Lord Baltimore. And Fortune lived on her land. And there is now, to this day, a game road on that land that I stood on. I believe this is the road where the Game family lived, where Fortune and her children lived for many years, because many generations were indentured to this family. But she ended up being indentured for 7 more years, and her children indentured until 21. Because
Just pause for a minute and explain the difference between indenture and slavery.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. So indenture is basically slavery with a time limit. That's all it is.
Okay, but you're still not getting paid, and you're not cared for any better. You're basically a slave, but for a period of time.
For a period of time, at some point you will be set free, right? That's at least according to the law, not necessarily in practice.
Sure.
That often happened to Black people. So indenture was the original system that they had of exploiting labor on this land in the colonies. And so when people came over in 1619, they weren't usually actually enslaved. Some of them were, others were indentured. The system of enslavement happened with these very first race-based enslavement happened with these very first race laws. So do you mind me just taking a moment to explain those laws?
Yes, go ahead. But I just want to keep going through these pictures.
I know.
Let me get to Harriet Smith in a minute.
Okay. So, but this is really important because it's fundamental.
No, go ahead. I'm just joking around.
In 1662, Virginia perceives that it has a problem on the ground. And I realized in the research, laws don't happen out of the blue. They don't happen because somebody decides, oh, this is how we should be living today. This is a good way to live. No, they happen because they are trying to solve a problem on the ground. And in Virginia, they were trying to solve the problem of mixed race children coming from unions of white men raping enslaved Black women. That's the bottom line. And so they said the problem was because Elizabeth Key, this woman who was born in 1636, she took her case to court in 1650 and said, my dad is an English citizen, and so therefore should not be able to be enslaved. And so therefore I am an English citizen, so I shouldn't be able to be enslaved. Oh, and by the way, I was baptized. I'm a Christian, and by English common law, you don't enslave another Christian. So I need to be set free, and she won. And then a lot of other people followed.
What was that date again? You blew by it, but I didn't pick it up.
No
Say it
problem.
again.
1650.
Yeah. Wow, that's early.
Really early, right? So it's only 42 years after the beginning of the colony, of Virginia colony.
Yeah.
So she wins her case in court, and a lot of other people win their cases in court. And then about 12 years later, 1662, the legislature they're suffering all these people winning their cases. They should not be enslaved because citizenship status comes through the line of the father, according to English law in this English colony. So they had a couple of choices here. They could have said, we're going to phase this slavery thing out. We're just going to go with injustice light, right? We're going to actually do the indenture thing. We're going to let people work their way into freedom. And then we're not going to do this anymore. That would have been injustice light per se, right? They didn't do that. Instead, they did what they still do to this day. They simply changed the law. They just simply said, okay, You think you should be free because citizenship comes through the father, and now you're a citizen and you can't be enslaved. Okay, we'll change where citizenship comes from. It shall henceforth be according to Roman law, and it will go according to the line of the mother. And in perpetuity, they added those two words, which created race-based slavery. So if your mother was Black and enslaved, then you too shall be enslaved and not a citizen, so able to be enslaved.
Yeah, and just emphasizing again, given the fact that those pregnancies were from rape and
rapes.
It was always going to be the mother, because basically it's all white men. The problem only arises when the master's raping his servant. It's not from the other way around. So,
well, except in Maryland, it was.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Maryland, because that's where Fortune was. So 2 years later, in 1664, Maryland has the General Assembly has a perceived problem on the ground. And their perceived problem was Ulster Scots women and Irish women who were indentured servants right alongside enslaved Black men falling in love with these enslaved Black men and marrying them and having children in the context of marriage that are mixed race. So two problems they perceive from this. One, it's a challenge to white male supremacy. And then two, what do they do with all these mixed race kids? Are they free or are they enslaved? So their answer to this, by the way, there were 600 mixed race kids that were born in the midst of the colonial era in Maryland and Delaware alone, right? So this is a real problem they're trying to solve. So they say, this is how we're going to solve this problem. Okay, so just hold on to your seat, Frank. This will kill you. If a white woman shall marry a Black man who is enslaved, henceforth, she herself shall be enslaved to the husband's master until the husband's death. And her children will be enslaved in perpetuity. So what did that tell me? It told me two things. One, wow, like white women are only white in so much as they support white men. If they don't support white men, they may as well be Black because they will be enslaved. That was the attitude towards white women, and really has been ever since to some degree, among the ruling class of white men. And so, and second, you have the in perpetuity. So this is actually about economics. It's actually about getting free labor so that they can make their tobacco and other plantations work, and work for a profit in perpetuity. So a few years later, the planter class, the legislators who are actually the planter class, they realize, oh my gosh, people are beginning to take advantage of this and force their white indentured women to marry enslaved Black men. And so what do? They put the keys of indenture or enslavement into the hands of the church. And the church becomes the auction block. The church becomes the arbiter, the holder of the key and the leveler of the oppression.
And this is in Maryland.
This is in Maryland, but it spreads because that's how things happen in those original colonies. It spreads,
and the church being
the
church being what at that point? What church are we talking about?
We're talking about the Episcopal, actually most of the churches, but Episcopal and Catholic.
Yeah.
So the Episcopal, especially in Maryland, and Catholic churches, they literally had the most accurate records of indenture and enslavement all the way through the colonial era. It only changed with the Revolution, and then it just became entrenched and federalized.
Let's go back to the pictures for a minute here, and I'm gobstruck by the history lesson here. I mean, there's so much here I don't know, and I don't think most people listening to this know. And you consider yourself fairly well informed, which right away talks about the, say no more in terms of the value of this book, because essentially, you always are thinking, well, don't we sort of know this? No, we don't know any of this. So thank you. Let's go to Harriet here for a minute and talk about her.
I love Harriet.
So Harriet, I got the right picture up here?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay, let's talk about Harriet for a minute.
Harriet right there is, we think she's holding a pipe because we were told Harriet smoked a pipe.
Yeah.
Harriet is the wife of Henry Lawrence, who we don't have a picture of. Henry and Harriet Lawrence lived. Henry was born in 1842 And he's another person on my mother's line who was free before the Civil War.
And just talk to me again about Harriet in terms of your mother's line. How far away are we here from your mom?
So Harriet is my second great grandmother.
Okay.
My
that's what
mother's first great grandmother.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Harriet was living in the early 1900s, 1908, 1909, when they went to her place, 1999, not 1909, it was like 19 teens, when they went to her place, and my grandfather took pictures of her there. So that was,
Yeah, I was
she
going to
in
ask
Indiana.
because, when I look at the first picture here, these first two pictures, I'm always interested when I look at the pictures of enslaved people or indentured people, who took the picture? How did it get preserved? Do you have any knowledge about that?
Yeah.
Can you just mention something? Because I know that it's a footnote of a footnote, but it's fascinating to me.
It is fascinating, actually. A lot of these pictures were taken by my grandfather. So Leah Ballard and Philip Fortune's pictures, we don't know who took those pictures. It's unknown. It's just been passed down in the family. I literally have her actual photograph on my wall, my family wall downstairs in the living room. I mean,
in terms of your family here, because I'm not a geneticist, so I'm not going to try this. What is the through line here? Because there are white people in your family, there's Black people in your family, somewhere, come through this process in Maryland and Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just curious, who were what race were your parents? Your parents?
We were Black. They considered
Black.
themselves, both of them.
Okay, then
Black.
when you get to these, they were both Black, and then Hiram here and Ella, just talk about them for a second, because I can't tell from that picture too much about them. Just tell me who they were.
So, okay, Harriet Smith was the wife of Henry Lawrence.
Right.
Their son was Hiram Lawrence, who you're looking at in that picture right now.
Right.
Hiram married Ella Fortune.
Yes. Okay.
Whose line goes directly back to Fortune Game McGee.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So that's where that comes from.
Yeah, and I was curious because you have there are people here. There's interracial couples here in your story, and I was just trying to figure out which ones were
which.
So and who married whom, and whether it was any, when Hiram and all these other people showed up, at what period of history were we at in terms of what happened with people of mixed race and all the rest of it?
So here what you're looking at when you're looking at Harriet and also Hiram, right? So, but let's focus on Harriet for a minute.
Yes.
You're looking at the period of history that is the Cherokee Trail of Tears.
Yes, right.
The Choctaw Trail of Tears, the Chickasaw Trail of Tears, I mean, all of that, right? So we believe, and it's been told in our story, that line of the family, it was really just said the Lawrences. They didn't say whether it was Henry or Harriet. So we always assumed it was Henry. But now, come doing some DNA, and actually we're realizing it's not Henry. It was Harriet who was likely the one who was Chickasaw and Cherokee, according to our family story. But here's the thing. I don't claim membership in any Native nation, because we can't. And the reality is that they did not walk the Trail of Tears. And according to the colonists, according to our government, you could not claim Native American citizenship unless your people actually obeyed their removal and made it to the end and signed up on the Dawes rolls at the end. So we're not on the Dawes rolls, so there's no way for us to claim anything. So they were absolutely cut off from, if it is true that they were Cherokee and Chickasaw, they were cut off from their people forevermore. And then they began to be listed as, that's Hiram sitting there talking. And he made it a regular practice to go out into the marshland in Elmwood, Philadelphia, where he owned a whole block of homes in the mid 20th century. And he would tell the stories. He would tell his grandchildren. But
I have a question, because when I look at this picture, and he's got his grandchildren. Yeah. And
that's my mom and my uncle.
Yeah, your uncle is quite dark skinned, and your mom and him. And I'm looking at the date 1948, and of course, in big chunks of America, lynching is happening, and it's not a friendly time for anybody, let alone a mixed race family.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, because it's amazing to see a picture of a grandfather sitting with his child at that period, obviously so comfortable with them.
Yeah.
And as a grandfather myself, I relate very closely to that picture. I like that picture. Just talk about that picture, talk about that relationship, and talk about what it was like to be a white grandfather and walking along holding a little black boy's hand.
Well, he did not at all consider himself white. He did not consider himself. I want to make that clear.
I'm just judging by the picture and the way, if you were
light skin.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, if you knowing what the temper of the times were, if you're just walking by or driving by in your Model T Ford or whatever, you look over there, this is not, it looks different.
Like a weird family.
Yeah. So talk about that.
So when I was growing up, I asked my grandma, what are we? I said, because on the playgrounds, my friends would say, oh, I'm part Cherokee. I'm part, everybody's usually part Cherokee, right? And so one time I went back to my grandmother and I said, what are we? And she said, we're Black. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that my grandmother was left behind by her mother, who was an octoroon. She was only 1/8 Black. She was 7/8 white and Jewish, according to the family story, right? So, and also according to DNA, my mom, the little girl sitting there, technically is literally, according to DNA tells her she's 50% white and 50% Black, right? But both of her parents identified as Black. And that's because that's the way it was. It was the one drop thing. Lizzie was Black in South Carolina. And she lived surrounded by the family who owned her family just 2 generations before. So she had to run north. She had to go north in order to escape slaveocracy, in order to escape them knowing that that's her class, the slave class. So when she came north, she passed. She passed for white in order to establish herself. But get this, she left Willa, my grandmother, behind because she was too dark. She would ruin the illusion. And when she finally established herself as a waitress at the Grand Hotel in the center of Philadelphia, and they didn't have Black waitresses, she finally then sent for my grandmother, and my grandmother never spoke about it, never spoke about the South again. We believe she might have been raped down there. We believe that
something awful.
Something awful happened. And so she never went back. And when I asked her, what are we? Because everybody else was talking about how they were Cherokee. She said, we're Black. And when I went back a second time, she said, okay, I'll tell you, we are part Native American, but never tell anybody that we are, because they'll think you're trying to pass for white. Right. So I never did.
Well, and that's a wrinkle that I would have never guessed at in a million years. I mean, you have to be in that to think of that.
In that community.
Why would I, that's just great, amazing to me. Let me just pause here for a minute and say that you are watching and or listening to, if you're listening to the podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Lisa Sharon Harper, who's author of a new book called Fortune, whose subtitle is How Race Broke My Family and the World and How to Repair It All. I want to jump way ahead in this process now and ask you about something. Sure. And that is, I don't want to miss this. I want to jump into part 3, the repair, the truth-telling as reckoning, reparation as repentance, forgiveness in the beloved community. And by the way, everybody, I know that we're jumping ahead in the story. Guess what? You can buy the book, okay? Yes. So we're not going to give it all away here, but I want to get to your philosophy. Yeah, we're not going to show you all the pictures and not tell the whole story. You're just going to have to buy the damn book, and that's it. I'm going to take you through these. And if I cut you off, it's not because I'm being bumptious. I'm just watching the clock here.
Sure.
So I'm going to ask you to go through truth-telling first and as a reckoning, reparation as repentance, and forgiveness and the beloved community. And I want to make sure we do this part in a little more depth than just skimming. Okay. So first of all, talk to me about what you mean by truth-telling as reckoning.
Yeah. We have not ever reckoned with what actually happened on this land to make us who we are today. So we look at days like January 6th. We look at what's happening with the voter suppression and voter subversion that's happening.
Yeah, because I just want to say one thing to the viewer and the listener. The book takes us through the Trump period. It talks about the white nationalism, Christian nationalism. if you haven't read the book, you don't know this yet, but the context is like this minute. Speaking of which, footnote here, when did you close out the manuscript? Because I was trying to figure out when you wrote the last word based on what you include in the book, which is Trump and the whole thing.
The manuscript was finished. Lord, I mean, with all of the different revisions, probably around summer last year.
Yeah, that's what I figured, because you're sort of up to the minute. You're almost bringing us to that point. Okay, let me get back to this then. Truth telling is reckoning, and I won't interrupt you again.
That's okay. So Jesus says, I am the truth. To crush the truth is to crush Jesus. To embrace the truth is to embrace Jesus. 70% of Americans claim Christian faith, and yet we're fine not knowing the truth. And there's no way for us to become a different society, to do differently, without knowing how we broke the world, without knowing how these hierarchies of human belonging that we established through law from 1619 forward, from Fortune's days to right now. We can't stop the patterns if we don't reckon with them.
Can I jump in one thing there? I'm listening yesterday to an interview with a writer for The New Yorker who works for the New York Times, detailing the number of states and laws being passed to stop the teaching of American history that's offensive to, when I say white people, of course, that's ridiculous. I don't mean white people like everybody to me and so forth. I mean to the segment of white nationalist Christians. So I can't skip the fact that your book is actually being published in the context of an attack on not just free speech, but we have to teach both sides of the Holocaust according to one law. Like, what's the other side? I'm not sure what that would be. We've got to teach both sides of slavery. Mouse, this picture book about the Holocaust, is being removed. There's laws in Texas and a number of other states allowing parents to now bring suits against teachers and school boards for teaching material they don't like. Okay, I'm not going to go on and on.
That's right.
But the context in which you're publishing this book is not neutral.
That's right.
It's not like this is different. I mean, we're in a period here that probably when you started thinking about these things, I'm sure you did not even envision a time when Republican legislatures all over the country are actually making laws now, essentially saying, if this book shows up in your school district, we're going to ban it.
That's right.
And we're going to sue the teacher for teaching it.
That's right. Do you know, I just found out, I think I can actually name her, Kristen Dumais, on a podcast that I'm doing, not the Freedom Road podcast, but a new one that I'm doing. She actually came out and said that she knows of a teacher that was fired for assigning the very good gospel in their classroom, and a grade school, fired because the very good gospel challenges white supremacy with the power of the gospel itself. So imagine now Fortune, which is really explicit history from the ground up, incredibly researched over 30 years. I know somebody gonna ban this book. I mean, somebody gonna ban it because it's a threat. It's a threat to the narrative. And that's
because I mean, the last thing we want to know is about these facts. These are not convenient. So let's get back to truth telling as reckoning, not just as a subject, but in this context where truth telling is now subject to being banished and individual teachers open to lawsuits modeled on the Texas anti-abortion law, where private citizens can harass now not abortion providers, but teachers who are teaching Black history they don't like.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
right.
talk about truth telling and as a reckoning in that context.
Well, let me just say, people of African descent in America are what make America America. That we would not have democracy without the struggle for Black freedom in America. Democracy landed on our soil with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And it is those amendments that are actually being challenged by this white Christian nationalist movement. And Dr. King said it best, actually, in his last book, that's also right over my shoulder, Where Do We Go From Here? He wrote it in 1967. This is what he said. He said, the segregationist, today we would read white Christian nationalist, the segregationist would rather have an American form of fascism than democracy if democracy required equality. And that is exactly what's happening. That's why those books are being banned, because we finally are at a moment where people are telling their own stories. And that is democratizing the narrative. And that is a threat to their power, because fascism requires control of the narrative. And that's how they're trying to control the narrative. So democracy itself is at peril through the banning of these books. Literally, this is one of the mile markers on the road to fascism. And so this is coming out at that time. And what I say is that in order for us to repair what race broke in the world, to make an about turn away from fascism, we have to do a deep interrogation of the narratives that we have been shaped by. We have to do some truth seeking. We have to do some truth listening. We have to then do some truth telling the truth. That's the only way for us to even begin to understand what happened so that we can repair it. And the first thing I say is for people of European descent and African descent and all the people, all the BIPOC people, we all need to do our family histories. Why? Because family history has the power to subvert those alternative narratives that are coming from the alt-right, or even quite honestly from our history books that only tell part of the story.
Well, and then going back to the Texas Textbook Commission, I mean, this has been going on a long time, but now, again, it bears repeating, it's being formalized for the first time with vigilantism now being unleashed on teachers and school boards. And it's just an amazing moment. Now, that brings us directly to reparation and repentance, because obviously, and this is a hard question for you to answer, but when I read a book, I always wonder, okay, who's this book for? And of course, one of the frustrating truths of history is that often the people who should be reading a book and being convinced by it are the ones who will not. So when you talk about reparation and repentance, the repentance part is not possible unless, in terms of who you're reaching, unless people who we would not expect to read this book read it. What is the expectation? I'm not saying you should know the answer to this, because this is an open-ended question that I think about my own writing all the time. Who am I actually reaching with this who doesn't already agree with me, especially since we're all living in these bubbles now?
Right. Though well, I'll tell you, the algorithm does make a difference. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm really hoping that this message will get out beyond the bubble, that other white folk who have family members who live in the other bubble will share the book, will share the stories with them.
Yes.
And maybe they'll be able to break the bubble.
Well,
So
and I
here's the
think you're
thing.
on to something, because we're much more likely to read stories than we are. The story of a family that is well written, like yours is more likely to break some barriers than just a didactic, screed on what you ought to all be doing and so forth and so on.
Exactly.
So go ahead. Yeah.
That was the reasoning behind writing this family story as opposed to just the last 3 chapters. So reparation is really about repairing the relationship that broke. And the relationship, in order to repair it, you got to know, when did it break and how did it break? It broke the moment that those first explorers landed on the coast of Africa and said, by edict of the Pope, Pope Nicholas V, we have the right to claim this land and enslave your people because you are not civilized. They failed to recognize the image of God in the people that were staring back at them. And get this, Captain Cook, not Hook, but Cook in Australia, landed on that soil and looked at all the indigenous people and said, there's nobody here. So that was the terra nullius. This is nobody's land. Hello, there were hundreds of nations on that land. So when you look at a person and say you are a non-person, that's the point of the break. And so what does it look like then to fix it? It looks like to recognize the personhood, to recognize the inherent dignity, to recognize the call of God, the divine call to exercise stewardship of the world, to exercise agency, to shape the world. And so that looks like, in terms of reparation, calling on our leaders to go to the impacted people and ask them, what do you say is required for things to be made well for you? So that we can be good in our relationship. That will repair the relationship, and it will restore their call and capacity to exercise stewardship even over this moment.
Yeah, I'm going to jump to the one here, Forgiveness in the Beloved Community. But before I do, I just want to ask you a question as someone who's very thoughtful and has been around the block on a lot of these issues. It seems to me to take the big picture in which the context in which your book is launched. We tend to see things all in terms of North America and slavery and indentured servitude and so forth here. But of course, the problem is global.
Yes.
Nobody's off the hook on this.
That's
In addition to which, just as your book is being published in the very framework of new laws by Republican-controlled legislatures actually banning books and putting teachers and school boards at risk for even teaching books like yours, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The other context is a global context in which the Uyghurs in China are being persecuted,
Right.
in which Saudi Arabia continues to spread a Wahhabist form of Islam that is both racist and sexist,
Mm-hmm.
in which Hungary is tilting toward the far right, in which Poland is now legislating against telling the truth about the Holocaust because it makes the Poles look bad,
Oh my God.
in which Britain has tilted to the right and is under the direction of a buffoon who took them out of the European market. In other words, the collective idea is being pushed back against, and in which probably our next president is going to be Donald Trump unless Democrats can get their act
into
together.
The world. Do not speak that into
Democrats
the world.
Hey,
No.
Biden's had 1 year and Democrats are already fighting amongst themselves and preventing further legislation. I'm not saying I think it'll happen, but these are really serious times.
It is.
So my question to you, besides holding forth here for a second, is this, and that is, how does your narrative, your micro narrative of one family, okay, fit in with two things? First of all, your book is an anti-fascist statement.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
100%.
The context in which it is being published is a context in which fascism is making a resurgence across the globe.
Yes.
We now have an Olympics going on in China, Winter Olympics, which is essentially being run by people with the same ideology, by someone who's made a personality cult there that is very similar to the 1936 Olympics in Berlin.
Wow.
We're in the same fix again.
Wow.
So the context in which your book's being published is where we are now, going to the Olympics in a country that smashes democracy.
Wow.
And in a global context in which fascism is on the rise, not democracy.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see that? I mean, forget your book for a minute. What's the context in which this book's being published, given your life struggle for these issues?
Back in 2016, actually 2018, I started the Freedom Road podcast. And one of the conversations I wanted to have—
Say the name again. You went through that quick. The Freedom what pod?
Freedom Road podcast.
Freedom
Thank
Road.
you.
Okay.
Right. So I started that in 2018, still running.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
January 2018. And one of the conversations I really desperately wanted to have was the impact of Russia in propagating fascism around the country, around the globe.
Yes.
And I believed, it was my gut. I didn't have a bunch of evidence. I couldn't write a book about it, but it was my gut that it's not coincidence that, the same year that Trump wins, we also have the whole thing happening in Australia. So they get, or very soon after that, they get a Pentecostal leader, prime minister, who is also like a Trumper. It's not a mistake that Bolsonaro, came into power in the same time as the Trump rule. Guess who was his political advisor?
Sure.
Steve
Trump.
Bannon. Steve Bannon was his political advisor.
Yeah.
It's not a coincidence. So I was thinking, there's too many dots here. We need to connect this. And my theory was that Russia is behind this. And do you know that just, I don't know, in the last few months, I saw a news report that said Russia is behind this.
Yeah.
I'm like, this makes sense. And why would Russia do this? Because Russia is trying to take down democracy. That is why. It is the Cold War reborn. That is the bottom line. And the best way, the fastest way, the surest way, the way of all time to take down, degrade, corrupt democracy is through racial hierarchy. Because through racial hierarchy, then you actually set up a two-tiered system or multi-tiered system where some people actually get to rule and the rest don't.
Well, they're doing it in China with the Han portraying themselves as the master race and even calling themselves that again. I don't know
So
why
it's
we
not
keep.
just a white thing. It's a colonizing thing.
But I just want to stop for a minute and say these are not authoritarian regimes. Give me a break. Russia and China are fascist regimes. Period. That's it. That's how they're being run. I don't care what they call themselves.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, that's really true.
That's the deal. And so we have a big chunk of the globe is moving in that direction, in the context of which
Of my book,
Lisa Sharon Harper publishes a book called Fortune, How Race Broke My Family and the World and How to Repair It All. So talk about that context a little more.
Why would I do this? Why would I? Well, first of all,
I think there's a lot of hope. I'm just saying to you that I know, as you've just expressed, that the context is huge.
Yeah.
These are vivid moments.
The reason why I think it's so important for us to be telling the truth right now, to doing the work of repentance, which is the work of reparation. That's all reparation really is repentance for the ways we broke the relationships. And then to do the work of forgiveness, ultimately, for those things that cannot be repaired in order for our own healing, is because there is no way forward without those three elements. And not only 70% of Americans claim to be Christians, but the majority of the world actually claims Christian faith. And many of these nations that are experiencing the backlash of fascism coming back and trying to take hold actually have histories of Christian faith that they
Russia being a case in point with the with the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, I bet Putin goes and lights his candles in the cathedral with the blessing of the bishop who's wearing a Rolex.
Yes.
I mean, there we go.
And this is what we need to do. We need to decolonize Christian faith. Christian faith itself has been colonized. From the time of Constantine, it has been interpreted in the halls of empire to reflect empire, to justify empire. And empire requires death for those who come under the thumb of it. Empire requires slavery for those who are going to be exploited by it. Empire requires the crushing of the image of God on earth. So we have to come back to the reality that Jesus was not of empire. Jesus was killed by empire. Jesus was a brown, colonized man from a serially enslaved people. And so every word that he said and every word written in the New Testament was written in the context of colonization by white supremacist Rome. So
I want to just say one thing here, and that is that I think that, people listening to this and watching ought to know something. And the reason I gave that long question on the context in which the book's being published, let me just say it again, and then I'm going to make my point that I'm getting to here. Lisa's written a book, Fortune, How Race Broke My Family and the World, and How to Repair It All. One way to see this book is a sort of a nice memoir, well-written, about a terrible moment of our history, but a family's journey through it, slavery and indenture. It's interesting to people interested in Black history. It's interesting to people who are interested in this subject or who know Lisa or who like the writing. But I want to say something different. And that is that the only way we are going to stand up against the fascism that we now face globally is by individually telling the stories that offer an alternative narrative and the truth. And this book is one of them. Okay, so it is not, the context I would give is a book in 1935 in Germany telling the story of immigration and persecution and pogroms of some family that was moving from one of the Jewish ghettos in Poland into Germany at the time in a way that would touch people in Germany at a moment when they could still change their minds.
Yeah.
We still have a moment in America we can change our minds. And this is an individual story that is in a global context as important as anything you could read, because in the microcosm of one family, we have the whole story of not only oppression, but forgiveness, reparation, and the way forward. So, if I could wave a wand, they'd be reading this in China and Saudi Arabia and in Palestinian communities in Israel and in Tel Aviv and all the rest of it, because this is a global story, Lisa. It's a global story. It's not just your family. It's a global story that needs to be told. So I want to thank you for writing the book, but I want to set the context, because there's a lot of books that we talk about on this program that are of great interest and great import, but they don't tell a global story. This is a global story. Maybe I'm choosing the wrong words, but it represents something very, very big. So talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, chapter 5, it actually takes it beyond the American soil, because the slave trade itself was a global trade.
Yeah.
And my own ancestors on my father's side came to the Western Hemisphere in a death ship called a slave ship, and were landed on the island of Barbados, right? So an outpost of colonial England. It was actually the first English colony. And they were landed there in the year 1750, according to Ancestry.com DNA. And within one generation, they were sold into every island in the Lesser Antilles. Every island in the Lesser Antilles. So the global slave trade actually makes the African diaspora a global story.
Yes.
Because we were not only, taken to America, we were removed from our land by most nations in Europe. Most empires in Europe had some level of investment, if not direct engagement with the slave trade. And so we're all mixed up in it. And it really had to do with that era of colonization in Europe.
Yeah. In the book, I remember reading you talking about some time you spent in South Africa. I think you were there in 2017, you were there?
That's right, 16 and 17.
Yeah, because I was there for a year in 1985 or 6, let's see, maybe 87. My family was over there. We had the kids in school and so forth. I was catching the tail end of the apartheid era, living there.
Wow.
Just before Nelson Mandela got out. And but what was so interesting to me as someone who came out of a Reformed Calvinist background is talking to some of the white Christians there who were still justifying apartheid, even though they knew the handwriting was on the wall on a theological basis. And so, when I talk about this being a global story, of course it really is. But the way I meant it was not just that obviously slavery is a global story,
right.
But the loss of freedom and the seesaw battle between democracy and fascism is now global. And by telling one story that is a warning finger in the air in terms of which way the wind blows, and the fact that not only can it happen here, it did happen.
Can I just say this real quick, Frank, before we close? It's also a global story because the theology that underpinned apartheid did not come from Calvin's Switzerland. It came from American Calvinism.
That's interesting.
You see what I'm saying? So what happened here actually influenced the world. What we did with our reservations, our Native American reservations, is what they copied when they created the Black townships. And what Hitler copied when he created the ghettos, when he created the concentration camps. Those concentration camps were inspired, horrible use of the word, but for lack of better language, inspired by Native American concentration camps before they removed them from the land. So it's a global story because ideas have gone around the world, evil ideas that have been put and actually then, quote, improved upon as they go and made more and more and more stringent. So those people in apartheid thought of themselves as improving on Jim Crow, making it even tighter, more effective, right? Yeah. So it's a global story. And now what we see is the Trump, that Trump era spreading across the world.
We do.
Because we
are giving
global,
encouragement to essentially an anti-democracy movement from Brazil to Hungary to, China, that he was making deals with, Saudi Arabia, the whole bit.
Yeah.
Wherever there was a regime that was anti-democratic, they found comfort in the Trump presidency. Wherever there was a regime struggling to remain, to preserve democracy and human rights, they're the people that he ignored and belittled.
That's exactly right.
Amazing period we're in. So let me just talk for a minute, Lisa. The book has just come out, or just coming out, for those of you who were watching a little while in the podcast or want to think about this. In our period of Zoom everything and not so much on the road stuff. Are you going to be out doing things? Are you resuming some of your busy speaking schedule and that kind of good stuff? When people get in touch with you, we're going to post links. Ernie, my wonderful producer, will post links to everything. And
Awesome.
of course, so we don't even have to say anybody who wants to get in touch with you will be able to through all those links, or buy your book, which we will post the links and so forth and so on. Anything else we should know about that you're doing right now? Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, you can always follow the movement of this work through blackfortunemonth.com. So over the next month, the Black History Month, we have declared it Black Fortune Month. And this is the month to read the book, to discuss the book, and then to take action. So at the end of the month, we're actually going to end on Capitol Hill talking with leaders about HR 40 and the TRHT Commission Act. HR 40 is that House Resolution 40 after 40 acres and a mule that we never got, that economists now say, if we had been awarded those things after enslavement, we would not be needing to talk about reparations now. And the Truth and Racial Healing and Transformation Act is all about an actual truth commission in America in order to find out what will it take to make things well for people of African descent here. So we're going to be reading, discussing, and taking action at the end of the month. You can also find out more about the book at fortunebook.us.
Which, of course, we're going to post all this. So if you weren't writing fast enough, it's all going to be linked wherever this podcast is posted and wherever our stuff goes and so forth and so on. So let me wrap up by saying I'm Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest has been Lisa Sharon Harper. The book is Fortune, Our Race Broke My Family and the World, and How to Repair It All. And just like I have to look at your subtitle, even though I've read it 100 times, I've got to look at my own book cover and say, I am the author of Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, which is in bookstores everywhere. So please note that as well. Thank you so much, Lisa, for everything you do. Really nice to see you again, even if it's at some distance here. And I wish you really well with the book. Stay in touch. We'll do some more on this. You know, when you have things you want to talk about in terms of the rollout of this or what you're doing in Washington, please get in touch with Ernie and say, I'd like to be interviewed again and talk about this. And you can, have the floor and say whatever you want on my platform.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. That's
just invite yourself back when you have more to say. I mean, I don't dare say when you have more to say. There's a whole book more to say, plus a lot of other stuff, but when you want to make something happen.
I appreciate that. God bless you, my friend.
Much love. Bye-bye.